You know, ever since Breath of the Wild released, it's been kind of a controversial game when it comes to the Zelda fan base specifically. Ever since it released, there have been conversations and debates about whether or not Breath of the Wild is a good game, a bad game, and everything in between. And while in this video we're not exactly going to talk about like every single thing that has been talked about the game, there is one particular point that I wanted to discuss, as it's something that I've always been kind of confused about, and something that I never really agreed with, but didn't really talk about all too much on this channel or in general, even. And that is that Breath of the Wild barely tells a story, and that the story is something that is not really the focus. I'd argue that the story in Breath of the Wild is just as important as its open world nature, and I find it odd that people don't really see it the same way that I do. So the point of this video is essentially just to talk about why I feel that Breath of the Wild is a game that does have a good amount of story embedded in it, and why I think that despite this, it also has one of the best stories in the franchise, despite its, different way of doing it. Now, usually when people talk about Breath of the Wild and its story, people tend to mention that, the game's story, there's not as much of it. Like, they were hoping for something that I guess would be similar to what Age of Calamity gave us, or other Zelda games in the past have given us, where it's essentially like a story with cutscenes in your face and constantly telling you what's going on, and then moving it from, point A to point B. My belief is that Breath of the Wild, while it does not typically do this, while we have cutscenes in the vein of, like, the memories, the occasional conversation with other NPCs such as Impa and the King, the game does have its own way of telling a story. Now, traditionally, storytelling, whether we're talking about video games, movies, books, or anything like that, most stories are told directly to the person consuming it. You're usually not experiencing a story unless it's directly told to you what exactly is going on. And the reason for that is that when it comes to books and movies, like, you don't really have any control as to what exactly is going on. You don't have any kind of say in how exactly you're discovering everything. You're pretty much watching another character do that for you, regardless of what kind of movie or what kind of book you're, consuming at the time. Video games, however, are a radically different and more interactive medium. You can discover things on your own. You can, figure out plot elements on your own. Breath of the Wild treats its world like it is its own storytelling vehicle. And this is why I have a hard time agreeing with the idea that Breath of the Wild barely has any story, or that the story is just barely there. And I think this comes from a perspective where we as Zelda fans are typically used to the more traditional way of storytelling. In every game from A Link to the Past onward, the story has essentially been told to us. The story has essentially been something not that we discover and figure out for ourselves, but something that is spoken to us through characters, spoken to us through cutscenes in, some games' cases. And so we never really had to figure out the story. We typically get told what's going on. And in most cases, in most video games, that is also the case. We also do have situations where a game will just tell us what's going on. However, there are other video games out there that have opted to go the route that Breath of the Wild also has gone down. You can mention things like the Dark Souls series, where Dark Souls doesn't really have a story that is told directly to the player, but despite that, there are entire YouTube channels that are dedicated and devoted to specifically telling you what is going on through the Dark Souls games. If you're not the type of player who will, dig for these sort of things, you may not ever know what exactly is going on in the Dark Souls game. But there is a story there, and the game does tell you what it is. It just does it through the expectation that you'll be exploring and reading, item descriptions and whatnot. Breath of the Wild isn't too different. Breath of the Wild has a lot of situations where you be reading item descriptions to figure out little, elements of what's been going on in Hyrule. And the idea that you have to go out of your way to find these memories that will also provide you some kind of cutscenes, these are all just going towards Breath of the Wild's overall theme. And then that is to just go out and discover everything on your own. And that isn't just talking about the geographic location of many things in Hyrule, but also to talk about what exactly happened to Hyrule. And that's part of the story. I honestly believe that Breath of the Wild's story would not be as impactful as it is if the game just directly told you what happened. Part of the allure to Breath of the Wild's story primarily comes from the fact that the entirety of Hyrule is destroyed. Link doesn't know what's going on because of his amnesia, and so you have to discover every little thing that you missed. Whether that is, that sword you saw, stuck in a rock in the Great Plateau, or figuring out what happened to all your old friends. Or even if you had any friends at all. In past games, we've had very dark stories told as well. And in Breath of the Wild's case, it's also a very dark story that is kind of not really realized at first. I mean, you know that Breath of the Wild has a story all about the fall of Hyrule, but the story doesn't quite hit you at first. I like to give Breath of the Wild credit on actually making me feel somewhat emotional for the champion's demise, despite technically already knowing this through, gameplay trailers and whatnot, and story trailers. I want to say that is an impressive feat, despite the game not being as direct in its storytelling as most games typically would be. Keep in mind that we've had games like Majora's Mask before, where the game in its entire theme is dark. And then we've had games like Ocarina of Time, where the game has its darkness, but it is essentially in contrast to the beginning of the game, where everything's very, happy and very childlike and has this childlike wonderment feeling to it. Majora's Mask has that contrast, and it is the favorite for many Zelda fans because of its darker story, in contrast to the more majority of the Zelda franchise, where you don't really get a story that is that dark in most cases, while Ocarina of Time does that same thing, but the contrast is within its own storyline. For that reason, I typically gravitate more to Ocarina of Time from a personal level, because I just feel like seeing the same story take part, but it goes from a lighter tone to a much darker tone. I feel like that contrast is really welcomed. And Breath of the Wild, if someone never watched the trailers, didn't know anything about the story at all, and just went into this game and saw how, colorful and beautiful it is, they might not be immediately aware of how much darker the game can be, how much more sad the game can be. And I feel as though that despite the game not focusing so much on putting the story directly in your face as often as possible, it still had me pretty sad when they would talk about the champions, when they would talk about what happened to them and their inevitable demise. It just goes to show that you don't really necessarily need a story that will be in your face at all times. And I know with Breath of the Wild 2, there's this sort of common hope that people really want Breath of the Wild 2 to have its story more focused, more in your face, more, I guess, in a more traditional sense, where the storytelling isn't really told through its open world exploration, but more so told through a more direct approach. And honestly, I'm going to give my own 2 cents here. I don't think the story will be as impactful if that is the case. It really depends on how exactly the story for the game is structured and how exactly they go about it. Because I feel as though Breath of the Wild as a game is designed specifically around its world and around the story that this world takes place in. While you can make that argument for every other Zelda game pretty much ever made, Breath of the Wild has much more of a focus on that world. I feel as though the story complements that so much more by having you go out and figure these things for yourself. Video games are, like I said earlier, a wildly different medium that can tell a story in a way that no other medium can. So, for me, I find it to be much more entertaining and much more immersive to be able to figure out this story on my own pace and basically be able to figure out what's going on and piece everything together. And mind you, Breath of the Wild is also, to my knowledge, as of the games that I've played anyways, the only game I've experienced where you do still get those cutscenes. They're just, littered throughout the world for you to discover and find yourself. While in my previous example with Dark Souls, you have all this text to pretty much just accommodate for the lack of cutscenes, even though a lot of the people you fight in Dark Souls do have things going on in the background and the lore and whatnot. And I also believe that just like Dark Souls has many YouTube channels out there that are completely and utterly dedicated to just telling you the lore and the story that was going on. Let's take a look at like the Zelda YouTubers out there who still to this day, like years later, are able to find topics and discussions and theories about things they just found all throughout Hyrule. And mind you, this is not a jab at them in any way. That's impressive. That's extremely impressive from both the YouTuber perspective and the games themselves. Like, it's very impressive. And mind you, while I feel like this was always a thing with The Legend of Zelda, where there was always like people who were able to, find these little things in the background and basically be able to have these theories and discussions based upon those things. I feel like with Breath of the Wild specifically, there has been more of that than ever before. How many videos have you seen on YouTube? And I don't know how often you guys search for, Breath of the Wild content on YouTube, but how many people have you seen make videos about the Zonai? How do we even know about the Zonai? Unless the storytelling through Breath of the Wild's own world was able to convey that to us. It goes a long way. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. The story of Breath of the Wild is a story all about exploration, discovering who Link is, while also figuring out what happened to the world before. This idea of mystery and exploration that begins Breath of the Wild, that kicks us off to one of my favorite games, would not have been as strong, I feel, if the story was directly told to us at specific intervals. And while there are many people who kind of hope that Breath of the Wild 2 goes out of its way to be more direct with its storytelling, I think I prefer it this way. I think I do. And I'm not gonna sit here and, defend the game at all times, because there are some things that I do feel like the game can do better. However, I just don't feel like the storytelling aspect specifically was weak. I feel like it was designed specifically with this in mind, and it did its job really well. I don't really have an issue personally with the way Breath of the Wild tells a story. So when I hear the idea or the conversation point about Breath of the Wild barely has any story, or Breath of the Wild just doesn't focus on it, I have to disagree. Nothing in what is conveyed in the world and the story that is sprinkled throughout said world ever really gave me the impression that the story was never the focus. Breath of the Wild has probably one of the saddest stories in the Legend of Zelda franchise, and it hit me pretty hard when Zelda said those words in like near the end of the game, when the champions had to take that picture together, and Link put the picture up in his home and everything. And mind you, all of those things are not like things that the game, forces you to go do and go look. You could beat the entire game without ever seeing any of it. And yet, we all know the story for this game. Despite the game never forcing us to go through any of it, you could have, explored Hyrule, gained your weapons, and go killed Ganon. And you could have done none of that. But yet, we know all of this information. Hell, we could even go even further and specifically mention the fact that in Breath of the Wild, a lot of us are also aware of the relationship between Zelda and her father. Despite the fact that that's only conveyed in memories and in that one book in Hyrule Castle, you can kind of get an idea as to what exactly their relationship was like. And you do get an idea with it. And it's never, directly told to you because it's something you go and discover on your own. All I'm saying is, and all I'm trying to convey with this video is that I just highly disagree with the notion that Breath of the Wild barely has any story. That is just a ridiculous statement to me. I guess you guys can let me know how exactly you feel about it, because I feel like every once in a while this conversation point comes up when it comes to Breath of the Wild, and every time I want to go off about this particular opinion of mine, and it seems like it's more popular now that people feel like the game just doesn't have a story that's as, I don't know, as big as other games. It's funny because, in my opinion, Breath of the Wild's story, I don't know, I connect to it a lot more than, say, like, The Wind Waker, which, again, I'm not saying The Wind Waker is a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but I like it more. I guess that's all I have to say about that. And I like Breath of the Wild's story more than a couple other Zelda games that I just didn't mention. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the open-ended nature, I don't really feel like it got in the way of the story in any capacity, because it complemented the story. And it made a lot of sense in the context of the world and the story. I just disagree. And mind you, if we can have Skyward Sword give us a very detailed story, but make the game really linear, and then go to Breath of the Wild, where the story is still one of my favorite stories in Zelda, while still giving me the open world game that I love, I see almost no downsides to this. Now, Breath of the Wild 2 will be a completely different story, but that's a conversation for a different video. So for now, just let me know how you guys feel in the comments down below. Let me know if you like the story of Breath of the Wild, or do you just completely disagree with me on this. Let me know, and until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.
Shifty, yeah, Shifty, wanna be the #1 gamer, come and get me. It'd be dope if you subscribe, could you like the vid, please? Take your time, you don't gotta do it swiftly. Shifty, Shifty, wanna be the #1 gamer, come and get me.